Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. You can do so at patreon.com/The History Network, and you can literally become a patron for as little as a few cents, and every little helps. Thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 33, Episode 7, The Aitape-Wewak Campaign. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast and our regular writer on the History Network podcast. On their seemingly inexorable advance south in 1942, the Japanese had occupied Aitape in northern New Guinea. On their advance south, Allied offensives to halt the Japanese advance began in 1943, and in April 1944, units of the United States Army, especially the 163rd Regimental Combat Team from the 41st Infantry Division, landed at Aitape and retook parts of the area, centred on the Wewak airstrip. This was to reduce Japanese strength on the island of New Britain, tying down troops on New Guinea, and to secure the Allied flank and act as a base for the upcoming Philippines campaign. Aitape did indeed become a base for US forces. Fighting was limited, despite there being 30 to 35,000 Japanese troops from the 18th Army in the area. Responsibility for the defence of the region was passed to the Australians, and from early October 1944, elements of the Australian 6th Division began arriving. Under the command of Major General Jack Stevens, the Australians immediately took on the task of recapturing the entire region. Japanese Commander General Hatatsu Adachi withdrew his forces to the east in order to concentrate them in the area around the Torricelli Mountains and Wewak. He was not helped by the fact his forces had taken a mauling during 1943-44 and in its attempts to dislodge the Americans from Aitape. The Japanese forces also lacked air and naval support. In contrast, the Australians had both air and naval support, the former provided by numbers 478 and 100 Squadron of No. 71 Wing RAA. This provided both bomber and reconnaissance aircraft. Naval support came in the form of the Wewak Force of the Royal Australian Navy, led by the Grimsby-class sloop HMAS Swan, named after the river, and 3 Bathurst-class corvettes, Colac, Dubbo and Deloraine, each named after an Australian town. All this did not mean that the Australians' task would be easy. There was to be hard fighting ahead, both in terms of the enemy, the terrain and illness. Beginning in November 1944, 2 6th Cavalry Commando Regiment led the attacks towards Wewak. The attack was on 2 fronts. The Cavalry Commando Regiment through the Torricelli Mountains in coordination with units from the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit, and native Papuans towards the important and well-defended area of Maprik, and a coastal front led by the 19th Brigade towards Wewak. In addition, there was the 16th Brigade and 17th Brigade. These 3 brigades would rotate the advance, with one held in reserve. Most of the action was minor, with small patrols, slowed by having to transport supply over rivers in flood. there was as great a risk of drowning than encountering enemy troops. In most cases, the concentration of enemy troops was small. The largest garrison was at Wewak itself, with 500 to 1,000 men. That meant that the advance was relentless and unbroken vigilance needed. The 16th Brigade saw 15 weeks of continuous action before they were relieved. The advance continued with occasional heavy fighting. By March 1945, as the Australians came up against entrenched enemy defensive positions and more stubborn defenders, Lieutenant Albert Chown led his platoon from Australian 2 2nd Battalion in an assault on an enemy position at Dagua, holding up the Australians' advance, and would receive a posthumous Victoria Cross. Maprik, the source of most Japanese supplies, fell by late April, taken by the 17th Brigade, and the attack on Wewak itself was launched in early May with additional naval and air support. As the attack went on, Farida Force, a purpose-raised unit made up of 623 Australian commandos, landed east of Wewak and Dove Bay on May 11th to prevent the Japanese garrison from escaping. Most of Wewak fell that day, although the fighting continued around the airfield where the Japanese had built bunkers in the hills overlooking the field. Despite the blocking Farida Force, the Japanese withdrew to the south towards the Prince Alexander Mountains, taking advantage of the high ground and the succession of bunkers they left behind them on each successive knoll and ridge. Each of these positions could fire on the previous position and needed to be taken out individually. Soon the only area not secured by the Australians was the rugged terrain and the plethora of overlapping bunkers to the south overlooking the Wewak airstrip. Those bunkers needed to be taken. The Australians had begun to use flamethrowers for the first time in April, but even they were not enough. Edward Ted, others called him Ned, Kenner learnt to shoot hunting rabbits in Hamilton, rural Victoria, Australia, during the Great Depression. His father had worked on the railroads, and as Kenner later recalled, their wages wasn't so hot, and so anything extra, both in terms of pelts and meat on the family table of 9, was a help. His skills would stand him in great stead when at Wewak. May 15th, 1945 saw him advancing on the northwestern slopes of the Wirui Mission Station overlooking the Wewak airstrip. It was against this rugged, unsecured terrain that No. 8 Platoon, A Company, 2 4th Infantry Battalion, 19th Infantry Brigade advanced. Heavy machine gun positions and artillery could fire down onto the airfield and the surrounding area and needed to be taken out. The most dominant of these positions was the 300-foot-high kunai grass-covered hill of Wirui Mission Station, also known as Mission Hill. To begin with, A Company had the assistance of a tank from C Squadron of the 2 4th Armoured Regiment, but, as Kenner later recalled, it cut out more or less, stranded up on the hill there, and we had to go forward on our own. The men had to proceed on foot through the tall kunai grass. The terrain was rugged and there was no artillery or mortar support for the infantry assault. The actions of May 15th were later described as the battalion's hardest fight in New Guinea. The eastern slopes and the top of the hill were taken by nightfall on the 14th, but the Japanese fought back from bunkers on the northwestern slopes. Kenner's platoon was ordered forward to deal with a machine gun post so that the company operation could continue. Kenner's support section, No. 5, and one other were to pin down the enemy position while the remainder of the platoon outflanked it. Kenner's section went into action when an enemy bunker opened up on them, pouring 13mm and .5-inch machine gun fire all around them. Kenner recalled, "We didn't know anything about that bunker at all until it opened up, and then that's when I got me good shirt ruined, I might add." Both sections started taking casualties, but Kenner attempted to put his Bren gun into a position where he could engage the bunker. Because of the nature of the ground, however, he could not get into a good position. Kenner recalled the action in a 2000 television interview given when he was 80. His no-nonsense approach to combat is still readily apparent. And anyhow, this machine gun opened up, and that's when I got up. I couldn't see down below. I got up and opened fire, 3 shots, and was a bit lucky there, and a couple got in the road of a couple of bullets. But then, when I was doing that, the second bunker opened up on me, and that's when I put that out of action too, with a bit of luck. I couldn't get at it properly with the Bren, so I called for a rifle, which one of the boys, Private Rao, threw up to me from the grass, and I happened to get hit there, so I was all right. Private Kenner stood up in full view of the enemy gun emplacement to fire his Bren gun from the hip in a hail of Japanese machine gun fire, bullets passing through his shirt between his arms and body. Emptying his magazine, he called for a rifle, and remaining standing all the while, calmly took out the enemy gunners one by one. The citation for Kenner's Victoria Cross, which he was in the middle of earning, reads slightly less dramatically. Private Kenner endeavoured to put his Bren gun into a position where he could engage the bunker, but was unable to do so because of the nature of the ground. On his own initiative and without orders, Private Kenner immediately stood up and in full view of the enemy less than 50 yards away and engaged the bunker, firing his Bren gun from the hip. As he recalled, he could not get a clear shot on the second bunker, so called for the rifle. The citation continues, despite the intense machine gun fire, he seized the rifle and, with amazing coolness, killed the gunner with his first round. There is no doubt that the success of the company attack would have been seriously endangered and many casualties sustained, but for Private Kenner's magnificent courage and complete disregard for his own safety. One thing few accounts note is that Ted's brother John was in the same section as him, also pinned down by the intense enemy machine gun fire. In the later television interview, Kenner said he couldn't explain why he had done what he did. The opportunity came to shoot, and I shot, that's all. When pressed by the interviewer, he replied, "I couldn't answer that, and I never tell a lie." He called himself a sticky beak, always wanting to know what was going on, and as he couldn't see what was going on lying down, he stood up to take a look. He also said, "It's just one of those things that you do, I suppose. It's hard to say. I think anyone would have done the same thing in the same position because, well, it's no good lying down there and doing nothing. You had to do something, and I don't think the Nips would have brought tea or dinner for me." The Victoria Cross citation goes on to speak of Kenner's magnificent bravery in the face of concentrated fire, and that the bunker was captured without further loss and the company action was successfully concluded. Vast amounts of munitions and equipment were captured, and the successful taking of the Wurui mission gave the Australians complete control of the Wewak coastal plain. Kenner's modesty and no-nonsense approach can be seen in his words, and the man himself captured in television interviews. He had enrolled in the Citizens' Military Force in the 1930s, and then the Australian Army in 1940. He said that he wasn't one of the brave ones who rushed off to war and only wanted to go and fight when he actually had to. He thought that the greatest battle a soldier had to perform was actually waiting to go to war. Kenner was assigned to the 2331st Battalion and served in Victoria and Darwin. In June 1943, he was sent to Queensland, training at the Jungle Warfare School in Kanangara. Kenner recalled, "We learnt the way to treat a jungle and the way the jungle treats those that is kind to them somehow. It might only be walking from here to there, but you've got to move with certain care or certain respect. I'll put it that way, and that's how it is." Kenner's battalion was then disbanded and its men sent to other units as reinforcements. Kenner was allocated to the 2-4 Battalion, 2nd AIF, and in October 1944 he sailed for New Guinea. It might seem odd that a crack shot with a rifle was given charge of his support section's Bren gun. He felled successive enemies with a single shot at Wurui Station, Nonetheless, Kenner appreciated his Bren, even if he knew its limitations. The Bren is more of a gun that you put on automatic and give them hell like that. The perfect shot with a Bren, you couldn't do it. Kenner's interviews make it clear that he was a character, what the Australians would call a larrikin, a mischievous person, uncultivated and rowdy but good-hearted, who often spoke out of turn to his superiors. A lot of times that I've spoken to higher up, like, say, a captain or lieutenant or something like that, and I'm told in certain terms that what he was doing wouldn't win the war at all. But when I look back at it now, everything I'd done and everything I was going to do, and failed like they told me, and I went against it to my own stupid mind. We know that on at least one occasion he was deprived of a lance corporal promotion, probably given to him after his action at Werribee Station, but he had lost it less than 3 weeks later. Kenner makes some interesting observations regarding not being in the big war, such as the important campaigns which usually fill history books. The campaigns around Wewak were characterised as small-scale patrolling with small-scale company attacks. The forces against which the Australians advanced were seldom more than a few hundred men strong, and in some actions only a handful. Kenner, however, rightfully maintained that war could be a little patrol, 1 man, 2 men, 3 men on patrol, and you get shot. Well, that war is the biggest war he's ever been in. Only a handful of men, and if you call them big, in my book, the small little patrol could be the biggest war of the lot. It's one life as far as they're concerned, and that's a big war. That's my idea of war. There's no such thing as a big war. It's a one-man job, and that's it. After the war, there were accusations that the campaign was unnecessary and an act of self-glorification by the Australian commander, General Thomas Blamey. This was unfair, as the Japanese troops on New Guinea were still numerous and posed a real threat, especially if they had gone unchecked. For all that, the Aitape-Wewak Campaign may seem like a minor one today. 2 Victoria Crosses were earned by members of the Australian forces during the fighting there, which puts the heroics they performed into perspective. Australians were awarded 20 Victoria Crosses during the Second World War, 2 coming in that Wewak campaign, and 2 others, Reg Ratty and Frank Partridge, during the 1945 Bougainville campaign, also in New Guinea. The apparently disproportionate number of awards of these minor late-war campaigns reveals, as Kenner contended, that war was a one-man job, and that the Australians who fought in those campaigns did so no less heroically than any other servicemen. The Aitape-Wewak campaign saw almost 18,000 Australian casualties. 16,000 of those were from malaria. Australia suffered 442 men killed, 11,421 injured, and 145 other deaths, such as drowning. Between 7,000 and 9,000 Japanese were killed in combat. 14,000 died from starvation and illness. Some 3 weeks after his actions at Werribee Station, Kenner was wounded in the mouth and evacuated to a military hospital in Australia. There he not only met his future wife, Marjorie, who nursed him, but he also overheard the doctors talking about his serious wounds and giving him only a 40 to 60% chance of survival. Kenner's response was typical. "Pigs, I'm the other way, don't you worry." After spending more than a year in hospital, he eventually pulled through and began the road to recovery. He almost missed the phone call to advise him of his Victoria Cross because he was in the shower. His immediate reply on being told that he had been awarded the honour, "Oh, that's a strange thing, you know, at this time of day." Major General Stevens would visit Kenner in hospital in Melbourne in September 1945 to congratulate him. Only a week later, the Japanese in Wewak would surrender. The men of the 16th Brigade continued to pursue the withdrawing Japanese, attempting to catch them in a pincer, with the 17th Brigade advancing from the prick. Fighting continued into August 11th, when the Japanese learnt that their government was contemplating surrender following the atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th respectively. Combat missions stopped at that point, and although Kenner would not see it, it would be on the Wewak airstrip where the Japanese General Hatatsu Adachi surrendered to Australian forces on September 13th, 1945, along with the 13,000 remaining men of his command. Well, thank you, Murray, for writing that script for us. If you would like to write a script for us, then drop us a line with your idea. We've had a few coming in, and we look forward to recording those in future seasons. So if you do have an idea, it can really be turned into an episode, and we'd love to hear from you. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast, even for just a few cents per episode. It really helps us produce this and keep it coming. You can do so at patreon.com/The History Network. Thank you to all our patrons. We really do appreciate each and every one of you. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.